Yeah, we're good to start.
Good evening, everyone. Once again, on the behalf of Division BMS, I, Ronak Raji, your Program Quality Manager, would like to welcome you back to yet another exciting session of Wednesday Wisdoms. And as always, like we do in every session, we have a terrifically interesting topic today. And I think something that is going to interest each and every one of you who is here present in the meeting, and subsequently who's going to listen to this beautiful session on YouTube later on. When we have all been confined in our house during this lockdown, I'm sure all of us have started appreciating technology better. And I think since the time all of our meetings, the Toastmasters meetings, have been started being conducted in the online environment, I think we have all finally accepted technology the way it is, and we are all trying to make the maximum use of it. One such technology which is growing at an unprecedented rate is podcast. In fact, one of the things that I really read recently was a quote which said that if you have freedom, do whatever you love. If you love to write, you can start a blog. If you love to solve problems, you can start a business. And it said, if you love to talk, you should start a podcast. So, and again, and very interesting thing which again I read was you just require one person to know your ideas, and then there are two people who know your ideas, and soon there's going to be a lot of people who would eventually know your ideas. With that, podcast has emerged as a great tool for us to literally put our ideas to millions of people out there. And we have a very special guest all the way from Spotify itself who's going to help us decode what podcast is and actually give break it down into what, why, and how of a podcast. Before I introduce him, let me just quickly tell you something about our guest and about this particular session and why it's different. This session we are doing in association with Anchor by Spotify, which is a tool of Spotify, which you'll soon know about. And and our speaker is the creator growth manager for Anchor in India. Anchor, a little bit about Anchor. It's a platform by Spotify that provides best in class creation, distribution, and analytics tool for every tier of creator. In this role, our speaker is fueling the Spotify's podcaster mission in India, which aims to democratize audio by enabling all creators to be heard regardless of experience level. That's a beautiful thought, because that's something that India truly needs today, for each person to be heard irrespective of who or what they are. uh, with a huge round of applause, virtual applause, of course, please help me in welcoming our speaker for today. Someone who loves reading fiction novels, which are basically fiction, listening to music, and of course, no surprises there, listening to podcasts. Please put your hands together and help me welcome under spotlight today's speaker all the way from Spotify, Rituraj Singh. Over to you, Rituraj.
Hi, thank you so much, Ronak. Thank you so much for that introduction. And so I think we'll get right into podcasting and understanding what podcast is, and understanding how can someone go about it, and also then taking and understanding how do you, in fact, if you're interested, how can you start making your own podcast. So I'll share a presentation, but before that, a little bit about podcasting. I think the term is as old as 2004 is when it was first, seen in usage. But and I think that time it referred to more of audio blogging, and eventually it has come to resonate with what we know podcasting has today. It's on demand audio. So I think a great analogy or a great way of understanding what podcasting is what your OTT platforms, say a Netflix or an Amazon Prime, are to television, is podcasting is to radio. So you can listen to audio, but it's on demand. So anytime that you want to tune into listening to on a particular topic, or you want to listen to a particular content, you can tune into an audio platform which supports podcasting, and you can start listening to it. So that's podcasting for you. It's fairly nascent in India in terms of how listeners are latching on to podcasting as a medium, and also for creators. So I think when we talk about podcasting in the West, there are still a lot of creators, a lot of listeners. In India, we are slowly but very, substantially picking up the habit of listening to podcasts. And as you also rightly said, Ronak, that we if there's something that a lot of people love is talking, and if you love talking, then podcasting is something that is absolutely for you. So let's just deep down do a little deep dive into a first what Anchor is, a brief on it, and B, if you are interested in making your own podcast, what are the steps that go into it, and maybe we can see a little bit of demo of Anchor as well. um, so as Ronak has already told you, but just to reiterate, Anchor is a platform which is owned by Spotify, where you can create your podcast, you can host your podcast, and you can distribute your podcast to multiple audio streaming platforms for free and from any device. And I think it's important for so when we say that the Spotify's podcaster mission wants a creator at any level to have a voice and be able to make a podcast. We mean it, and that's the reason why Anchor is a free tool. So anyone who has an idea can go to Anchor and start using it. um, a great reason and a way that sort of resonates with our whole objective is also something that manifests in terms of data. So about 75% of the podcasts that are on Spotify are Anchor podcasts, and this is a global number. In India, we aren't far behind. In India, the number is also around the same, the same data, which is we see about 70 to 73% of our podcasts on Spotify in India are also Anchor podcasts. So now let's get into how, if for example, today you want to start a podcast, how do you go about it? Now, these are the four basic steps that one needs to know or one needs to follow in order to start a podcast or launch a podcast. First is the ideation phase. Of course, we all know ideation, the which is the phase which is most important, because that's where you put your thought together. That's where you make your own vision for what your podcast is going to be. The second is the preparation stage, where you start putting those ideas into substantial plans. The next is, of course, the execution, where you start recording, you start editing, and you are ready to start with the podcast. And the fourth is, how do you launch it? So it's much more than just click of a button, but how do you plan to launch it? And how do you ensure that more and more people know and talk about your podcast? So let's go into all of these steps one by one and understand them in a bit of detail. So the first is ideation. You see, ideation also has a number of topics. So I'll just jump into each of those topics. The first is, what do you make a podcast on? So I think one would say a topic that you're very passionate about, or a topic that you can talk about. And I think a great way of putting it is a topic that you are curious about. So for example, if you don't know what is that, maybe you could go and ask your friends that what is that one topic which comes in and you can't stop yourself and you keep on talking about it. So you pick up a topic where you know a great deal about it, or B, you can do a lot of research about, or you have people who can do a lot of research about it. uh, because what you communicate, your audience is listening to it, and therefore it's imperative that you have your research in place, that you know your topic well, that whatever you, and I think since it's an audio medium, what's important is A, your content, and B, how you package it. So it's only your voice that that your audience is listening to, and therefore they can sense the conviction in your voice, and therefore you have to be convinced about the topic, that you are podcasting about. And I think something which is very important is that always think about your topic from a listener's perspective also, as to, if I were to listen to a podcast on this topic, what would I want to listen to, what how would I want it to be packaged, because you yourself at the end of the day are also a consumer of podcasts. So think it from that point of view also. And it's therefore important that you understand your audience, you understand your topic, and that's when you zero down on what your podcast should be about. The next question that people ask is, what can my show sound like? So if you've heard about podcasts, or you've heard any of these podcasts, you would have seen that there are some which are monologues or solo commentary, where someone is just talking about a particular topic. And so this is where, as a creator, you might need not do a lot of homework as opposed to some of the others, because here you know what you're speaking about, you are absolutely sure what your cue points are, and therefore you can start talking about it, you can keep a script ready and start recording. So that's solo commentary. The second is a fictional storytelling. Now, this may require a bit of audio production. How do you make it more interesting? I think a great example of it is when Gimlet Media started a podcast called Homecoming, or we have a podcast on Spotify which is called Bhaskar Bose. So these are fictional storytelling, but they are done with a lot of background score and background music, which makes it even more exciting. Another way of doing it is repurposed content. If, for example, you have an already running YouTube channel, or you are already a content creator, say you are a blogger, you might want to repurpose that content into making a podcast. However, you will have to have necessary tweaks because it needs to be an audio friendly content. Then there are interviews that we all are familiar with. Then there is non-fiction storytelling, which is equally interesting. And I think non-fiction makes your job as a creator much more responsible, because whatever you are quoting or whatever you're talking about has to be facts and has to be verified facts. Another podcasting which again might need more efforts is a panel discussion. I think it's great because you get so many different perspectives. But as a creator, it also means that you need to have your homework ready, you need to block a lot of different calendars and ensure that everyone is in time for the recording. And the last is a hybrid model, which is you decide how you want to structure your podcast. Do you want to start with a monologue, go into an interview, or you want to start with an interview, maybe expand it into a panel discussion? That's up to you. So these are some formats. And when you are thinking about formats, you also need to think it again from an audience perspective. When you make a podcast, it also has an individuality of its own. So you may want to have segments that an audience knows will always happen. Say you make a podcast, and at the end of the day, you always have a Q&A section. So your audience will always be ready to listen to it, and will know that now that the podcast has ended, a Q&A will follow, or you have a weekly recap. Or basically, if there are two people or more than two people who are doing the podcast, how do you do your introductions? Or do you want to have an introduction that that sort of follows, that's part of all your podcasts? So those are also part of formats, because they in a way standardize your podcast in the mind of the audience. They know what they want to listen to, or what they are listening to, and how will it flow. Again, another interesting topic is, how do you choose a name? So I think a great dipstick of choosing a name could be that when you are that your name should be able to communicate what your podcast is about. And a great way of doing it is write down a few names, and take it to a couple of people who do not know anything about your podcast or your podcasting idea, and just show them that name and ask them what do they think this name stands for. And I think that's a brilliant way of you getting genuine feedback from people, whether they understand it or not. So your podcast can have very creative names. So, like, we have a podcast called 22 Yarns, but the moment someone gets to know about 22 Yarns, they know it will talk about cricket. It also in a way tells you that these are stories about cricket. Or you can have descriptive names that actually tell you what this podcast is about, like we have a podcast which is called Poems to Calm Down To. Or some people, they just use their name and start a podcast, and we have a podcast like that, which happens to be one of our really popular podcasts. It's called Puri Jagannath, which is done by Puri Jagannath, who's a really popular South Indian filmmaker. And it's a podcast in Telugu that does pretty well. So you can think about how your podcast name can be. Another important thing that you need to consider is the show description. Because if someone is on podcasting, if someone is listening to podcast or is on a platform and has just seen the name of your podcast, they may want to know a little bit about what this podcast is. So even though your name is the first giveaway, they might want to know a little bit more description about it. So just put your brains together and think about a description which sort of encapsulates the central idea of your podcast and the reason and the intent behind it, so that a listener knows that this is what I'm getting when I'll be listening to this podcast. And the and another important thing is, how will you release your podcast. It's important to think about it right from the word go. It's because that in a way tells you how the entire planning is going to be. When will you record? How many episodes you should have written? How many episodes should I have ready before I launch my podcast? All this is dependent upon how you'll be publishing your podcast. And that is important because, again, your audience will know when to tune into an audio streaming platform and start listening to your podcast, because today is the day that your episode comes out. So they should be in the habit. It's not no rocket science, but it's absolutely what we are also used to. When we watch a television serial, we know that Monday 9 o'clock the show comes. So every Monday 9 o'clock you tune into television to start watching it. And that's how the audience is able to that's how you do appointment building, and that's how the audience is able to know that when should I tune into a podcast or your podcast. And therefore that publishing, that how will you publish it, is a very important factor. um, the next is, how do you go into preparation? So I think one of this is an interesting question, and I think I'll take a few minutes on this, which is equipment. Um, People always ask that, should we invest in a lot of equipment? Does it really take the level of the podcast a notch up? Of course it does. I mean, if you have great equipment, if you have great audio quality, it just means an elevated experience for the audience. However, I think, as Indians, jugaad happens to be our favorite word. And I think one of the ways that I was in a conversation with a creator, and he shared that how does he recorded his podcast, so to ensure that it's clear and there is no disturbance, is you shut down your room, switch off the fan, open your cupboard, put as many blankets or quilts into it, and keep your phone and start recording. Because of the quilts and blankets, the voice will never echo or there'll be no disturbance. And I've heard his podcast, and they sound amazing. So I think, and so whenever you feel that you are ready to invest in equipment, please go ahead and do. But if you think you want to try, there are different ways and means of, or rather hacks, which you can use to ensure that your recordings are clear and the recordings are done well. Cover art, again, an important aspect, because these are all first impression points, whether it's the name of the podcast, whether it's the description, whether it's the cover art. So your cover art should also reflect what the podcast is. So having the name clear is a no brainer. You may want to have your own photograph in case you're someone who already is a creator, and that people will be able to relate to you because of your photograph. So it's great to have a photograph on your cover art. Or if you're talking about topics which are very human centric, then also it's a great idea of having your image on the podcast cover. What is also, I mean, these are optional, but thinking about who your co-host should be in case you want to do it with someone. But then you should know that you share a rapport with the person, who talks about what aspects of the podcast, who does the introduction, do both of you do it, how will the flow be. Or having guests, in case you're doing interviews or in case you're doing panels, then thinking through as to what would be the profile of my guests, um, being very sure that the guests you have are equally articulate, because again it's an audio medium. So you would want your audience to listen to someone who's able to put their thoughts together in a coherent manner, and therefore make it more effective for you. And now we come to the recording and editing bit, which is where a tool like Anchor comes into picture. Everything else you're doing right now on your own, deciding on how your podcast will look like, what is the format, name, cover art. The cover art is also something that Anchor can help you, but recording and editing is where you can get onto a tool like Anchor. And so there are certain aspects that you need to keep in mind. Is so if anchor.fm is where you go if you want to check out how the interface is, and I'll take you to the interface later. So recording, you may want to have a test episode to understand how your voice quality is, how the recording quality is going on. You may want to use certain tools which can help you edit your podcast better, or you can even use the creation tools or the editing tools that are available on Anchor. So I'll take you through the UI. The Anchor also gives you the option of remote recording. So if there are two or three of us who want to record a podcast together, there is a feature on Anchor which helps you record. Of course, both people need to have the app on them, and then you can start recording. So you can do remote recording. Another important aspect when you are doing
Come,
the recording is
come, Snowing. Come on.
how you how you do the intro, outro, and transitions. Introduction is something which may remain the same for all your podcasts. So having those introductions recorded and kept as a file in Anchor is a great idea, so that you can attach it um, before every podcast. Outro is something how you end your podcast, and that could also be in a way standardized, which is so it's just like a television serial, or just like any other show, or an episode, where you know how it starts, where you know how it ends. So intro, outro are important. And also, how do you build your transitions? So from your intro, how do you come to the main podcast? If you are having, say, multiple interviews, how do you transition between them? And Anchor has background music, interlude music, which you can use to do all of these, and which covers your basis in terms of your intro, outro, and transitions. Um, it's important that you are, as I was saying, that planning is important. Your publishing cadence that we spoke of, that how do you publish, how many episodes, and therefore it's important for you to know how do you bucket your episodes, which is how many episodes should I be ready with before launching a podcast. Because it's easy to launch, but it takes more efforts for you to continue releasing episodes at the frequency that you've decided in the beginning. So we always recommend a creator that at least have 3 to 6 episodes recorded and ready with you. So when you are ready to launch, the first few weeks, or the first couple of months, you are very comfortably just concentrating on talking about your podcast through your network, through your social media, and not really bothering about, oh, I have to record another episode, oh, my script is not ready. And it also gives you time to plan some of your next episodes well. I mean, I know of creators who plan the full season, record the full season, and then they start launching it so that they can see how the season is going. They can look at the analytics. They can understand how the numbers are. So that's important. Trailer is a great way of giving a sneak peek to your audience about what your podcast is. And so when you are about to launch a podcast, it's a great idea to always start with a trailer, talk about it on your social media, talk about it in your network, that you are about to launch a podcast. Give them a sneak peek through your trailer and build that interest in the audience, so that the day you launch your first episode, um, people just people know that they've been waiting for it, and they tune into and start listening to your podcast. There are people who create trailers for every episode that they do, which is also interesting, because then their audience sort of gets a sneak peek into what the next week is going to be like, or what the next episode is going to be like. And the final thing is your launch strategy. So launch is when you are ready with your ideation, you have prepared yourself, you have recorded your podcast, you have your cover art is ready, your description is ready, and you've just filled in all the fields. And that's when I think the first step is ensuring that your logistics is in place.
It's
Um,
okay. Thoda thoda chhod.
it's
Release
important.
again, take back. Release and take back.
Sorry, I think, yeah. Then the next is your approval process. I think it's important for you to know that Anchor as a platform also distributes your podcast across audio streaming platforms, even though it's a Spotify company. So when you do a one-click distribution through Anchor, it distributes your podcast to Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, Castbox, Pocket Cast. And all of these platforms have their own approval timings when the first episode or the first trailer is released from your podcast channel. On Spotify, it's a matter of a few minutes to a couple of hours when your podcast is ready for approval and can start. You can start listening to your podcast on Spotify. But some of the other platforms may take a couple of days. Worst case scenario, a couple of platforms may take a few weeks, maybe 1 or 2 weeks at max. So just be prepared when you are ready to launch. And that's another reason why some people prefer to start with a trailer, because you launch a trailer, it gets approved on all platforms. That's the time you also take to talk about your podcast across your network. And by the time the trailer gets approved and you are ready to release your next episode, which then starts reflecting on all platforms more in about a 24-hour basis, or sometimes even in real time. And how do you release a podcast is also now this is so once you launch a podcast is when your learning as a creator starts. We have seen through our experience that podcasts released on weekends don't really get that much traction, and therefore we recommend people releasing it on weekdays. However, I think it's something that that a creator learns in their own journey as well. You can release an episode in the first few months. You can play with all of these things, release an episode on Monday and see how it does, release an episode on Friday and see how it does. When is your audience listening to your podcast? What days of the week they're more active? What days of the week is your podcast being listened to when you release an episode on a certain day? That will give you an idea as to when should you launch your episodes. So I think the first couple of weeks will only go on in learning more about your own audience, learning more about how your content is doing, how long should my podcast be, when should I release them, how often should I be releasing my podcast, so on and so forth. Um, so that's so let and then I think we already spoke about how many episodes you should launch with. And we say your own network, your own social media is your best friend when it comes to talking about podcasts. You can ask your friends to share it with their friends, because I think it's imperative that you build an audience organically for your podcast. And the thing about audio content is that once you're able to build that audience, the audience is highly likely to stick to your content, because they like your content for what it is, for what you talk about, for how you've packaged it, rather than a lot of paraphernalia. um, so you can use different tools that can help you make design, fancy creatives for your social media, that where. And it's also important that you maintain that consistency whenever you're talking about the podcast. So if you've used a certain set of colors, or the way you've designed your cover art, you should try and replicate the same when you're talking about it on social media, or through your network, so that your audience, every time they see those colors, every time they see a creative in that particular format, they know exactly what they're seeing. And what we call as top of the mind recall is there for your content. Another thing that people do is do a lot of guest swaps, where you can talk about someone else's podcast, or someone else can talk about your podcast. You can connect to different creators, and in a way collaborate with them, so that their audience knows about you, your audience knows about them, and in a way we build the community. um, so now I think it's time that we can quickly just go through how Anchor looks like, and after which I think we can, if there are any questions, I could answer them. And so I will now share my screen and take you through Anchor. Um, so if you see, this is how Anchor looks like. I'll just stop the presentation. So if you just have to go to anchor.fm, and which is this anchor.fm, and you will come into your profile. I've already made a test profile, but I'll take you through how do you set this up. So as you can see, the cover art and everything is there. So let's go into the profile. And this is how your public site would look like. Now when you are on Anchor right now, I've made a profile, but otherwise when you come on Anchor, these are the four things that you will always see on Anchor, which is it automatically gives you cues onto what your steps are going to be. So make your first episode. The moment your first episode is done, the Anchor will automatically say that your podcast is ready. The next is distribute your podcast. Then it'll take you through how do you distribute your podcast. And uh, monetization that you see here is a feature which is available only in the US and not in India right now. And the last step is get listeners, which means the moment you start having your listeners, um, Anchor will start showing you analytics for how your podcast is doing. So let's start with this. About your podcast, it will also always ask you your podcast name. So let's here put Rituraj. It will ask you a description. So let's just say it's a test podcast. Now, once you're here, you will see that it shows you a cover art. Now, a cover art is something that you can either design and upload as an image, or you can search for an image on Anchor. Anchor also has options of some images that you can find. Maybe if I select an image like this and continue, so you will now see your image here. You can change the font. um, you can you can see whether you want to have, you can change the color of your font. You can see whether you want to have text on your cover or you don't want text. That's also something you can do. Whether you want to have the Anchor logo, not have the Anchor logo, is again something that can be easily done. And your cover art is done. You can of course make your own cover art, and upload it on Anchor. That's a feature that Anchor has. And once the cover art is done, then you can talk about your podcast category. There are various categories of podcast, so you can best describe what your podcast falls into, the category of. So let's say it's an education podcast, and it asks you to pick up the language. So let's say it's an English podcast. Now once you're done, it would ask you questions about you. So your name, your email ID. Uh, Please remember that the email ID that you use here will be used to send any communication to you, or anything related to your account will come on that email ID. So just ensure that your email ID has been input correctly. And here you can connect it through your social media channels. And once this is done, once this is done, you can save all your settings. It will ask you to verify your email address, and so I think I think I've created a couple of different accounts. So this is yeah. So it will go and ask you to you to verify your email address. Once you're done, you can start with the recording bit of it. So this is how it will look when you want to now start recording your episodes. So this is how you can record. um, I mean, I think this is something that you can explore by yourself. But the moment you want to start recording, it will ask you whether it's on your phone or on your desktop. It will open your microphone and you can start recording it. You can also upload audio directly onto it. Um, the moment you're recorded, this is so this is where your audio file will start reflecting, where it says click to upload or drag files here. um, and your first episode will start reflecting there. Once your episodes are ready, or once you're ready to release your episode, you can listen to it. You can for example, here these are some transition music that you can add, or background music that you can add. And once you're ready with your episode, and you come back on your dashboard will automatically start saying that you have recorded your first episode, your podcast is set up, and now you can start distributing your podcast. So when you start distributing, these are the podcast platforms that Anchor does a one-click distribution to, which is Spotify, of course, Apple Podcast, Breaker, Castbox, Google Podcast, Overcast, Pocket Cast, and Radio Public. And you can also manually distribute your podcast to some of the other podcasting platforms. Basically, when you make a podcast, you get an RSS feed. You use that RSS feed to make an account. Say, for example, if you want to go on another podcast, another audio platform, and they will ask you for an RSS feed, you just have to copy paste your Anchor RSS feed. And once their approval process is done, you will start listening to your podcasts on. Or your audience can start listening to your podcast on other platforms as well. If you see, the interface is fairly simple to understand. You just will have to toy with it a little bit, and you'll be good to go. So I think this is where I'd like to end this session. I think I really hope that it wasn't too much of information or information overload, but I think it just follows the basic principles that you would think about in terms of content. And as far as the interface is concerned, it is a simple interface to use. So if there are any questions, please feel free to ask me right now, or
Right.
you can either ask, or if later there are any questions, you can either write to Ronak or Hardik, and they can let me know and I can answer. However,
Right. So, Rituraj, what we'll do right now is, in the interest of time, people can just use the chat box that is there. You can just type out your questions, and we will quickly ask them. So, I had the first question, which is just to start set the tone. What is an ideal length of a particular podcast? Because I've seen podcasts of like 2-3 minutes, and then the 22 yarns, which is a 40 odd minute podcast. So is there a benchmark or something that you need to ascertain to?
so ideally, I think as you very rightly said, you will hear podcasts which are 3 minutes, 2 minutes long, and you will hear listen to podcasts which are about an hour and a half long. So it's basically the content and how your audience is responding to that content, which is most important. One might say that I think there is a belief that if you ask someone what should be an ideal length, someone will say 20 minutes. But I think you might want to stick to that time limit or not, because actually depends upon how your audience is reacting to your content. I mean, I have heard podcasts, which is an anchor podcast, which is in poetry, and it's a 3 minute podcast. And then as you said, there is 22 yarns, which goes beyond that 20 minutes. So as I was saying, that the time that you launch a podcast, a couple of weeks, is your learning period. That's when you get to know how my audience is reacting to my podcast length. So there is no right and wrong answer for this.
All right, thank you. So the next question is by Samir. He asks, is Anchor and paid platform? If yes, what are the charges?
It is not a paid platform. It's an absolutely free platform. At no point will you be asked to pay for using any of the features. And the reason behind it is very simple, that we believe, and our objective is that we democratize podcast creation, as Anchor. That and I think it serves the purpose, because as there is more audience that is wanting to listen to podcasts, they would want to listen to a lot of podcasts, and therefore it only gives us merit that we are able to provide a platform that is free to use, so anyone who has a story, wants to talk about something, can do it.
Right. Thank you. The next one is from Arpit. The question is, we are seeing a lot of interesting podcast forms through these days, including video podcasts, while podcasts are generally associated with only audio form. Does Spotify or Anchor.fm support video form podcast as well? And what are your thoughts on that?
Right. So, I think you're absolutely right. An audio podcast is something that you would see it's fairly popular in the West. A lot of podcasts are video podcasts as well. Spotify supports it, supports video podcasts as well, or as we call as vodcasts. Anchor at this stage does not, but it's also something that is in the pipeline. Um, and of course, the reason why people sometimes prefer to have a video podcast is to show what goes behind the scene of that podcast being created, or if they have guests, it just makes the experience more personal in a way. However, I think in my opinion, audio, the reason why podcasts, why podcast becomes an interesting medium is because you are able to, when you are able to envision someone else's thoughts. When you're listening to a story and you're just listening to it, you can envision it in a really beautiful way. And the second thing is, it only keeps one of your senses involved, whereas in a video, two of your senses are involved. You're listening and you're seeing it. So it just helps multitasking easier when you're listening to just an audio podcast. That will be my take on it.
Sure. Thanks. The next question is from Pratibha. She wants to know, would like to know more about voice test, how it helps in cover art editing and other facilities are available to all. Any tutorials for adding music?
So yes, what I can do, and maybe you can facilitate this, Ronak, is I can send you the deck that I have just presented.
Yes.
That deck also takes you to a lot of these tutorials, to reference points to each of those, which can sort of help your members here to better understand each of these features. Of course, there's so much that you can cover in a 1 hour session, but it's a fairly comprehensive deck that I have with me, which I'll share it with you, and you can then take. And it basically will take you through all of these things that I spoke about, but more than that, it'll also give you a lot of reference points.
Right.
So when I speak about cover art, what are the best practices of making a cover art? All of those are included in that. So maybe that will be able to answer the question in a more detailed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, I truly believe that the deck that you presented would be like a great playbook for almost everyone who wants to start their own podcast and how to go about it. The next question is from Mohammed. The question is, does having a unique thumbnail art for each episode technically enhances your online presence? Also, how would you recommend using podcast logos for Google, Spotify, Apple, so on and so forth, on your thumbnail art? Also, I see SEO as an impact on online announcements. How advantageous and effective is it going to get in coming future? There are two questions.
Right. So, to answer the question as to should you have a different, thumbnail art for each episode, a lot of creators have that. A lot of podcasts have that. Especially creators or podcasters who, for example, are doing interviews. They would always have the person who they've interviewed as part of their cover art, and therefore it becomes a different thumbnail for each. If you're talking about a different topic, in a way, in each of your podcasts, and you would want to sort of make it a part of your thumbnail art, it's a great idea, because when you're talking about it on social media, on your network, and you know how we consume social media. For example, if you post it on Instagram, the way we scroll on Instagram, that your picture should be able to tell me that what you're going to talk about in your next episode. So it's a great idea of having different thumbnail art for your different episodes. However, there are creators who stick to one and do well. So I think that's something you can always see for yourself. SEO has an impact on online enhancement. I'm not really sure how is this. I mean, how what exactly does the question mean? Um, but when you, I think, does it mean that when you are, say, on a platform like Spotify, what your podcast is, does it help in featuring your podcast? If that's the question, then I think, yes, in a way, it's not really SEO, but how the platform does machine learning. So a very simple example of it is, I listen to a lot of crime podcasts. I really like them, and therefore, whenever I go to my Spotify account, I always see more recommendations of those crime podcasts, and these are podcasts that have, in a way, built their audience who sort of have a stickiness for the content. So that's there. Also, I think one more question that I asked was having other logos. You can, because it also tells your audience where all can they listen to your podcast. So you can include it on your cover art. So I know that do not have to necessarily listen to it either on Anchor or Spotify, but I can also go on Google Podcasts and listen to it.
Right. Thank you so much. Next question Jim has asked. He asked, can you name each episode differently? I see there is only a place to name the main podcast name.
So your main podcast name will be there, which is, so if right now you go on, say, Spotify or Google Podcast, wherever, you will see that a podcast has a name. That's the name which I had put. But every time that you'll be making an episode, Anchor will ask you, what will this episode be called? So you can name your each of your episodes differently.
All right. Again, Mohammed has just circled back to the question: can you access analytics on Anchor? So, do you have like a
Absolutely.
dashboard to do it? Like,
Yes. So the moment your podcast starts getting an audience, Anchor starts evaluating that data and gives you analytics. And it gives you analytics in terms of both for your full podcast as well as episode wise analytics. It will tell you how many times your podcast has been played. It will give you information on what is your estimated audience size, how many unique users you get, or how many unique listeners you're getting. It will tell you how, in which, or on what all platforms is your audience listening to it, where is the majority listening to. It will give you a split of what geographies are listening to your podcast, what age group is listening to your podcast, what gender, what is the gender bifurcation of your audience. So all this information, Anchor. So once you have released your episode and you start getting audience, Anchor dashboard will automatically say that your analytics is ready and now you can start using it.
all right. One of the questions which Mohammed also had was how different is Anchor from other hosting services like Zanker, etc. And generally, like what are the USPs that apart from that, it's a part of Spotify. What is that it brings to the table?
So I think one of our biggest USPs is that it is a free platform. A lot of platforms that you go to will start with a free model, but will after a few episodes will require you to have a subscription. There are podcasting platforms that will tell you that if you want to use a certain feature now, pay this much. So there is a tier of payment. So while it will say free, but the moment you go there you will realize that it's, there are too many terms and conditions to that free. So that's one. B, I think being a part of Spotify, the the sort of USP it gets from there is that we are that Spotify is an audio company. We are an audio first, we believe, and therefore, unlike some of the other players, our sole focus is on audio, and therefore we are continuously working towards ensuring how we can add more features onto onto Anchor. And Spotify also is one of the largest audio platforms in the world, and in India also it's growing its base rapidly, which means that you will be having more understanding of your own content because it's part of Spotify. Because you know that you will be able to reach a bigger audience, get better analytics. Whenever we have features that are rolled out, keeping in mind both the platforms, like in the US, we launched a feature called Music and Play, where you can start, which is still in the beta testing version, which is where you can do your podcast and also incorporate music from Spotify into your podcast. So we are looking at some of those innovations simply because we are also part of Spotify, and Spotify supports it.
Right. One last question that we had was one was how soon would monetization start in India? I mean, you just said that it's available only in US
Right.
currently. How soon do you think it will start in India? And second, as like once we become creators, and will Spotify probably help us with marketing credits or some sort of an push wherein we get if the podcast is really big, probably you put it in the pole position like how Twitter and Facebook do. Will Is there some sort of a support available?
Right. So to answer your first question, which is on monetization, unfortunately at this stage, I will not be able to commit on any, even a tentative timeline on when monetization comes, because monetization is a function of a lot of different things. It's available in the US because the US market has become so it's a fairly mature market, and there is a lot of interest in podcasts when it comes to advertisers, marketers, brands, so on and so forth. So with Spotify, we are trying to build that kind of awareness in the market as well, and grow the audience. And also, of course, there are of course questions about technical, the technical part of it that goes into starting monetization.
Right.
But it can be it can it's a matter of when rather than if we will have monetization. But I think uh, the when part is something that we are yet to sort of freeze on. The next is, you asked about how what happens if a podcast start doing well, how does it feature. So you can go to you can go to Spotify right now, and on the tab that talks about podcasts, you can see top podcasts and trending podcasts. You would be surprised to see that a lot of those top podcasts are anchor podcasts. I think a couple of days back, I was seeing some of the top 30 podcasts. There are about 14, 15 podcasts that come from Anchor. And when you go on that list, you can start seeing. So I was talking about Puri Jagannath in one of my
Right.
slides. You would see his podcast last week was ranked fifth in the top podcast for Spotify. So the moment you start getting audience, and so someone who is interested in podcast goes to that list, can automatically see your name there. If you've been able to build an audience, or if your content is doing well, you'll come in trending podcasts. So that is there.
Right. Thank you so much, Rituraj. I think it was a fabulous session. It really, I think what Pratibha just mentioned in chat box, I would just like to echo her thoughts. We are so inspired that I'm sure the bucket list for 2020 was literally thrown out of the window. But 2021, the bucket list will definitely feature podcast as the numero uno, as a part of the list. And thank you for inspiring us to do something creative. Like, all Toastmasters love to talk. So I mean, that's basically you have the right audience over here. So again, once again, thank you so much. I think once we share the deck that you presented with the audience out there, I'm sure there would be a lot more questions, and you can just share your contact details, and we'll definitely we can share the questions with you.
Sure.
Again, thank you everyone for joining us tonight for this Wednesday Wisdom session. I'm sure all of you have great takeaways. And as I always say, this was probably the last 1 minute that we are standing between you and your dinner. With this, we officially bring the podcast session to a close, and we will be hanging around for about 5 to 10 minutes. So anyone who has questions, please feel free to just wait back, and Rituraj will definitely answer those questions for you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining. I think Mohammed, you had a couple of questions. Maybe you can just switch on your audio and video and ask Rituraj those questions directly. One sec.
Hi, Rituraj. Thank you so much for this inspiring content shared with us. I
Thank
really felt excited to register for this. Been waiting for 3 days, and I've got some takeaways from some of the questions I have shared with you. One more question persists is that even my sister also runs a podcast on Spotify. Now she uses multiple thumbnails for each of the episode for but when you take it to Google and when SEO has an impact on it, and let's say I search for her podcast, all of a sudden her podcast thumbnails come along in the Google Images section.
you.
Now
Okay.
she uses another hosting site which is not Anchor, something like Hopper or something. And what I feel is if I use a single podcast cover starting mine, will that be the same in the Google Images as a reflection because I have multiple episodes with just one podcast cover?
Okay, so I mean, I actually do not know that it starts featuring in Google Images, but if it does for one, I think that is how it will for others as well. Yeah.
Yeah, because there is a difference in the hosting side which you have just showed us. That's the thing.
Yeah. So I mean, even so, Anchor only hosts, and then after which it just sends your podcast to Google Podcast. So your podcast episodes will go there. So it doesn't change how Google Podcasts work.
Right.
It just gives you another platform of sending that podcast to Google.
I see. Just one more thing. Do you also run a personal podcast by yourself? Because I'm kind of interested in that.
I actually don't. And that is my sort of bucket list for 2021, that I've been planning to launch a podcast for the longest time, and so hopefully by 2021 even I should be.
Right. Sure. Then that's it from my end. Thank you so much
Thank,
again, Rituraj, for this.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Any questions anyone has? We can probably wrap up in a couple of minutes. Arpit, you want to go? Is there a question? Can you unmute yourself?
Hello, hi Rituraj. Thank you
Hi.
so much for this session. It was a very enlightening session. Thoroughly enjoyed it. A few questions. So, in fact, as someone who is already, thinking along the lines of starting the podcast, and I was really excited for the session. Uh, when I go to the web app and even the Anchor FM mobile application, and it says record your first episode, what I was slightly, curious about is, are there any audio processing tools that these platforms offer? Because uh, I think the whole idea, or as anchor.fm poses, is hey, it helps you start your first podcast, and naturally these people will not have a lot of audio equipment, will not know what compressors are and all the technical jargon around recording. So as someone who just takes out my phone and starts recording, a new idea, maybe a storytelling podcast, are there any tools that can help improve the clarity or the reverb in the room, or those kinds of simple things, like how you have filters?
Yeah, so I don't think so. You will get access. I mean, or there are so many creative, so many tools to really elevate your audio recording to another level. Of course the basic ones are there, because as you also rightly understood that it's a platform that makes it easy for people to use to to start making a podcast. But as I was saying that the deck that I'll be sharing, it will give you some of the um, websites or tools that we also recommend in case you want to do a better job with the audio, with your editing. So those also come as part of it. So like we recommend using Audacity for your audio, in case you want to make it even more better. So to answer your questions, it still is not it is not equipped with handling that kind of your audio clearing or leveling or compression and all of those. But we do recommend other um, tools for it.
All right. Just as a follow-up question to that, a small follow-up question to that, is the fact that if suppose, but as you rightly said, right now the platform does not support such advanced features. It may in
Yeah,
the future,
right.
Um, if I do record on say GarageBand or Audacity, that will be an episode in itself, right? I will have voices and other Foley sounds and sections already. So can I just upload that directly as an audio file and create a podcast and have cues
Yes,
and chapters within the app?
absolutely, you can. In fact, what a lot of YouTubers also do is take out just the audio from their YouTube episode and upload it directly onto Anchor to make it a podcast. So you can absolutely just upload the audio file.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Thanks.